Australia is getting stronger fast. That seems obvious now.
Yes, the 2026 National Defense Strategy pushes major investment toward long-range strike and integrated capabilities. They are fielding F-35A, expanding Hobart-class destroyers, and acquiring HIMARS with GMLRS for land strike.
So on paper, Australia looks fully prepared for modern conflict.
On paper, this looks solid, especially with AUKUS submarines planned before 2030 and deeper U.S. alliance integration. Add KC-30A tankers and Wedgetail, and you get range, awareness, and coordinated strike across the Indo-Pacific.
That should be enough in theory, right?
In theory, yes, because deterrence depends on credible capability and the ability to project force regionally.
Then why is defense suddenly talking about supply chains again?
It might just be planning discipline, but the timing does seem a bit unusual.
If Australia is strong, why stockpile fuel right now?
Governments often build reserves as precaution, especially when supply chains are volatile across the Indo-Pacific. Australia recently secured around 100 million liters of diesel under new strategic reserve powers.
That sounds less like routine planning and more urgent. Why expand emergency fuel authority in 2026 specifically?
The new legislation allows Export Finance Australia to secure shipments quickly if markets tighten or disruptions occur. They are also coordinating imports from regional suppliers like South Korea and Brunei to diversify risk.
But if supply is stable, why rush multiple shipments simultaneously?
There were reports of about 44 days of petrol coverage and dozens of incoming fuel tankers to reinforce reserves.
44 days does not sound like a deep buffer.
It is not extreme, but it is within international norms for advanced economies managing commercial supply chains.
Still, military planning usually assumes worst-case scenarios, not average conditions.
That is true, and defense has been emphasizing resilience and sustainment alongside capability in recent planning documents.
So the concern is not just about having weapons ready.
It might indicate that supply continuity is becoming as critical as force structure, though that might not fully explain the timing.
If capability is rising, why does fuel pressure increase at the same time?
Because advanced forces demand more sustainment, and Australia is expanding long-range operations across the Indo-Pacific with platforms like F-35A and KC-30A. Those systems extend reach, but they also increase dependency on fuel, logistics, and continuous supply throughput.
So more capability actually creates more strain on the system. That contradicts the assumption that strength reduces vulnerability over time.
It does create a tension, but the idea is that stronger deterrence offsets those risks before conflict escalates.
But deterrence depends on sustained operations, not just initial capability deployment. If F-35A sortie rates depend on jet fuel, what happens under supply disruption?
Sortie generation would slow, and tanker support like KC-30A would become constrained if fuel availability drops. That does not fully align with the assumption of continuous high-tempo operations under stress conditions.
Then naval operations face the same issue with Hobart-class endurance. And HIMARS mobility depends entirely on diesel logistics chains.
Yes, land systems like HIMARS and Boxer require sustained fuel convoys, which increases exposure across long distances. This may contradict earlier assumptions that adding strike capability automatically improves operational resilience.
So, every new system adds another layer of dependency instead of reducing it.
That appears to be the case when considering the full system rather than individual platforms.
Then the real question is not what Australia can deploy. It is what Australia can keep running under pressure.
If sustainment cannot match capability growth, then the original assumption about strength may not hold.
If one refinery fails, does Australia's entire fuel system wobble? Geelong lost output in April, and it is one of only 2 refineries. So redundancy is minimal, not strategic.
The Geelong incident reduced diesel and jet fuel output temporarily, and that exposes how thin domestic refining capacity actually is. With only Geelong and Lytton operating, any disruption creates immediate pressure on imports and distribution networks.
Then fuel availability is not controlled domestically at all.
Not fully, because Australia relies heavily on imported refined fuel transported across long maritime routes through contested regions.
So, F35A sortie rates depend on fuel arriving safely, not just aircraft readiness. KC-30A tankers cannot extend range if fuel supply is already constrained.
Correct, tankers redistribute fuel, but they cannot compensate for shortages at the strategic level. This means air power depends on logistics continuity more than previously assumed.
And naval operations with Hobart class face the same limitation at sea. And HIMARS mobility collapses if diesel logistics break down.
Yes, every major capability relies on sustained fuel flow, and that dependency increases with operational tempo. This changes the entire assessment of readiness under real conflict conditions.
Then Australia's strength is not defined by its weapons. It is defined by how long those weapons can operate continuously.
That assumption no longer holds, because capability without sustainment cannot deliver the expected combat effect.
So, what is the correct way to read Australia's military strength now?
The issue is not capability but availability, because platforms like F35A or Hobart class only matter if they can be sustained continuously in operations. Australia is building advanced systems, but sustainment depends on fuel imports, logistics networks, and industrial support that remain partially external.
Then strength should be measured over time, not at deployment. Not what can be deployed first, but what can be maintained longest.
Exactly. And this is where the gap appears between strategic planning and operational reality across the Indo-Pacific environment. Programs like AUKUS submarines and future frigates will not fully mature before 2030, while current logistics constraints already exist today.
So the timeline of capability growth does not match sustainment readiness.
That mismatch creates a structural constraint rather than a temporary limitation, especially when fuel security and supply chains are not fully sovereign.
Then alliances should compensate for that weakness, at least in theory. The United States and regional partners could stabilize supply lines.
Alliances distribute risk but do not eliminate it, because partners rely on similar fuel networks and contested maritime routes. In a regional disruption scenario, shared dependency may amplify pressure rather than resolve it.
So the system is interconnected, not independently resilient.
Yes, and that means Australia's real question is not whether it can fight, but whether the entire system can endure sustained pressure.
So Australia's strength is conditional, not absolute anymore. It depends on sustainment, not just acquisition decisions.
Yes, deterrence now rests on whether systems like F35A and Hobart class can be sustained under pressure, not simply deployed. And that shifts defense planning from platform-centric to constraint-aware, especially before 2030 when key programs are still maturing.
Then alliance credibility also depends on shared logistics resilience.
Exactly. Alliances extend capability, but they also share vulnerabilities across the same fuel networks and maritime routes.
So the real metric is endurance, not firepower alone.
That reframes the entire assessment, but it does not resolve the underlying dependency on external supply chains.
Then the system is strong but tightly bounded.
Strong, but constrained.
What breaks first under pressure?